Hi, everyone. Welcome to SoDA Series Live. We're so happy you can be here with us today. SoDA Series Live is a collaboration between the Adobe XD team and SoDA, the Society of Digital Agencies. And each month we come together to bring you candid, in-depth discussions with agency founders and creative leaders from all over the world. Our goal is to help keep you informed of some of the key trends and topics helping to shape and influence the creative industry. So we're happy you're here with us today. I'm Kristen Bell from the Strategic Development team here at Adobe, and I'm joined by Tom Beck, Executive Director of SoDA. Hey, Tom.
Hey there. How are you, Kristen? Great to see you.
Good to see you. And we're your hosts. So, Tom, for those joining who are not familiar with SoDA, would you do the honors of just giving us a little rundown on your organization and its mission?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We appreciate it. It's good to be with you today. Again, I'm Tom Beck, Executive Director at SoDA. And SoDA is a global membership organization for founders, owners, and leadership teams, primarily at digital design studios, production companies, digital agencies, digital consultancies. We have 95 member companies in 20 countries around the world. And, our mission, our purpose is to help founders and leadership teams become a little bit smarter about running their business, become more connected to a global community that can help them, and to become more connected to the resources that they need to create a great digital business. And we do that through a lot of knowledge sharing, peer collaboration, advisory services, research, and benchmarking studies. SoDA's been around since 2007. I was a member for many years before I had the privilege of joining as executive director. So I'm thrilled to be here with you all today, and we're looking forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the great partnership all these years, Tom. It's been a pleasure. So to start things off for today, I'd like to introduce Jay Ganadin. Jay is Director of Strategic Development here at Adobe. He comes from an agency background and loves talking all things design. So you're in for a really great conversation today. Hey, Jay. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thanks. Glad to be here.
So, Tom, would you do the honors of introducing our guest today?
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. Welcome. It's great to see you.
Thanks.
And our guest today is Mark Pytlik. Mark is the founder and CEO of Stink Studios in London and New York primarily. Mark helped found the studio back in 2007, and Stink has just been a fixture on the creative scene, just doing incredible work for 14 years now. I've always admired Stink's work and was thrilled when we were able to get them into the SoDA community a few years ago. Mark is not only a great creative himself and has worked with incredible brands like Nike and Spotify and probably anyone else you can think of on your top 10 list. But he's also as an agency leader, just one of the most thoughtful. One of the most thoughtful leaders I know, and it's just a privilege to welcome you here today, Mark. And thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so before Kristen and I drop off, just a quick word for the audience. Kristen and I will be in the LinkedIn group monitoring questions and conversation. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to lob them into the group, and we'll take some time at the end of the session today to raise those questions. So feel free to either just post them in the group, or you can message Kristen and I directly. Other than that, we're going to drop off, have a great conversation, and we'll see you back again at the end of the session.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Kristen. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
I'm really, really well. How are you?
Great. So I like to do a bit of research on who I interview. So I often go to Twitter. So in October last year, you wrote, "Does anyone have any good recommendations for some chill beats to sip Pepsi to?" No, you don't have to answer that. I thought it was an interesting start because of your sort of journey. As founder of Stink Studios or Stink Film, and then the sort of sabbatical you took and then going into Spotify, and maybe perhaps chasing a dream of working around music. So that's what I'd like to learn more about. It's kind of your journey. I'm always interested in the journeys that people take with their creative careers, and then the journey you've taken with Stink Digital, now Stink Studios. So how about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can start at the beginning. I come at this through the side door. I mean, I started my career as a journalist, as a music journalist specifically, and was a professional full-time music journalist for a good 6 or 7 years, kind of as a first career. And then I think this was 20 years ago, but even then I think I saw the writing on the wall in terms of just the declining sort of role of journalism and the lack of opportunity in the journalism world generally, and sort of pivoted to advertising journalism at that time. I'm Canadian. I was based in Toronto for a good long time. And that pivot sort of led me to a magazine called Boards Magazine, which is sadly now defunct, which is a real shame, because I think had the leaders kept it going, it would probably still have a lot to offer and a lot to say even today. But Boards Magazine, it was a global advertising magazine, and its remit was specifically to cover production. So I ended up as one of the editors of that magazine. I was there for a good 4 years, and it was an incredible first sort of entree into advertising because, first of all, the magazine had a global remit. So I was traveling all over the world, visiting agencies and production companies in London, in the US, going to Cannes, going to the awards show, doing the circuit, and also just interviewing and meeting like some incredibly popular and insightful people along the way. Some of the world's top directors, some of the world's top creative directors, always with an eye on the production aspect of the work, what it took to go in, what it took to make a piece of work, what the challenges were. And so it was an incredible crash course and an amazing way to sort of build a contact base in the industry in general. And that sort of 4 years coincided with the advent of interactive, I think. I mean, there was a lot of interactive stuff that was happening in a first wave before, but I'm talking like this was sort of the subservient chicken era, barbarian group, like starting to like make a name for themselves. In fact, we worked a lot with them in those 4 years because they were such an interesting company. But there was Crispin, there were all these other agencies. There's Goodby starting to do interactive and to do it really, really well. And that had always been a huge interest of mine, just in addition to music, was just computers and programming and digital art. And so that became my beat as part of the magazine.
Like, at this point, we're kind of like the early aughts, mid 2000s or so.
Yep. This would have been, yeah, exactly that. Like 2006, maybe 2007, around there.
Yeah.
So it just became part of my beat, kind of covering interactive as well. And I got to meet a lot of interesting folks on that side of the spectrum. And it led me to Stink, actually. I think not everybody is aware of the fact that Stink is actually two companies. So there's Stink Films, which has been around for 25 years. They're a powerhouse kind of television production company. They've got offices in 12 cities, 10 cities. It's hard to keep track sometimes. But obviously I met those guys through Boards, and we built a relationship, and one thing led to another, and that led to them offering me a role to come to New York to try and start an interactive production company. Wow. And so that was the end of my time at Boards, and that was kind of like the start of Stink Digital. I moved to London, England to start that company. And it was a bit of a slow burn, I would say. Like in the first 12 months, maybe 18 months, I was just really learning to work production side, learning to work in production, understanding how to interact with agencies. But then slowly we built up a staff and we started to do projects. We were really lucky in that a couple of our first projects were famous. We did Philips Carousel, which ended up winning a Grand Prix in Cannes that year.
It was the first one, right? The first like Cannes film for digital. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it won a Grand Prix in the film category, but I think one of the major things that sort of gave it gave it a nose above the rest of the competition was that it was technically an interactive film. And that was a moment in the industry where I think the community wanted to nod to interactive film and different forms of filmmaking. So that was really what put us on the map. And we just kind of grew organically from there. And so we've taken a lot of twists and turns over the last 14 years, like a lot of companies that started in classical interactive production. You know, it's we no longer really work with agencies that often. Most of our business is direct to client. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, you know, because we work further upstream, we have a super robust strategy function. You know, we have a much more robust creative concept function. We kind of operate a little bit more like an agency these days, but I'm very, very keen, even as we're functioning more like an agency, that we never really lose the muscle memory of working in production.
Oh yeah.
So it's a big task for us to be able to sit at the table with clients and think strategically about their business, but also constantly sort of speak through the muscle memory of executional focus. You know, it's very important to us to always be able to talk through the work and to be quick and to be executionally minded.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's one of the biggest challenges that we have right now, is to try, you know, as we recruit more and more people from the agency side, to not become like a classical big A agency, because I think in many ways, like one of the reasons for our success is because clients want to work a little bit closer to execution, and they expect that from us as well.
That's great. That's great. So, I mean, do you even see perhaps an evolution where you might work with production companies, or that you truly want to keep that in as part of one of your strengths?
It's a great question. There have been moments in the past where we have worked with other vendors. And usually those are very, very specialist vendors who do things that we can't do, or who do things just way better than we would be able to do. That's always a weird moment, actually, when the tables are turned and then you're suddenly like operating like the agency and there's a production vendor working into you. So yeah, that's happened a fair few times over the last few years. But I think generally speaking, as a rule, like we try and keep our hands in as much of the production as possible, just because even now that we've kind of pivoted to more agency side, it is, I think, still where we're strongest and most comfortable.
That's great. That's great. So that's a good segue into just talking about the work a little bit more. So, you know, we've heard from a number of agencies in the SoDA community that the pandemic has actually helped shift the client side marketers back to this belief in the power of truly digital immersive experiences, which I think is something your agency or company does well.
Yeah.
You know, rather than sort of employing digital just as a sort of above the line or performance marketing tactic. So have you seen a shift? You know, I mean, like some of the other SoDA agencies, have you seen that shift from in digital projects and what clients are looking for?
Yeah, 100%. I think when it started, it took the form of a lot of clients wanting to do a digital experience to supplement an experiential in-person event that they have, you know, are no longer able to do. So certainly in the first like 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, especially, I think like a lot of our cohort, we saw a ton of briefs for how do we take this IRL experience and move it to a digital experience. I think another thing that has happened, though, on the back of that is there just seems to be like a new cohort of clients who want to do digital experiences for the sake of doing interesting digital experiences. And for me, the jury is still out as to whether that is going to stick once things open up and once things return to normal. But it's been, you know, everything in advertising is so cyclical. I remember being at Sync Digital 15 years ago, and we were doing marker-based AR, and then AR went away for a good long time, and now it's fully back. And there's a bunch of things in the industry that are like that. You know, they come back in some souped up form. And there's a part of me that wonders if digital experiences to some extent are going to come back in some souped up form, because one interesting thing that I'm seeing from my side is that like there's a whole new generation of clients who hadn't even previously considered a digital experience as something that could be part of their playbook. You know, we've been in this world of above the line campaigns and social content for such a long time that it's become the default playbook for folks Two, I think a fault. I think it's become kind of like the boring thing that you do when you don't have a bigger idea. And I wonder if returning to digital experiences and being forced to return to digital experiences to some extent has kind of like opened some people's eyes as to the possibilities there. So
yeah, I mean that's interesting. I remember doing a campaign when I was at Razorfish with a bank, and we're trying to go after a certain demographic, millennials, right? And we were saying, well, I mean, millennials are listening to NPR, like you want to include maybe some, radio, of course, but then podcasts as well, right? What about advertising and podcasts, right? So, thinking of digital in that respect, and really trying to surround a person's life. Do you find that that's the case, that the media mix is really shifting in that direction too?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's funny because, again, like some of the same tenets that were true 15 years ago still hold true. I think like when you're creating a digital experience, especially if you don't have media attached, it always serves you to come up with an idea that is going to be intrinsically shareable. And how do you pull the lever of intrinsic shareability within somebody? Generally, you have to do something that appeals to their sense of ego or to their sense of self or to their sense of curiosity about how they stack up against other people. So in my experience, like the digital experiences that we have done that have been the most shared or that have been the most talked about with kind of millennials specifically have ticked those boxes. And in fact, we did one website. This was a while ago now. It was probably like 2014, 2015. It was for Ubisoft, and it was for a video game. I can't even remember the video game now. It was so long ago. But the site itself was called Predictive World, and it involved a Facebook integration, and it was really well done. But it was like just a bunch of levers that you would basically pull. It would scrape your data and tell you, how long you would live or what you might die of, or like all sorts of crazy predictions about your life. And the data analytics piece was actually pretty robust. We did it in collaboration with a university, and I think it gave you output that was just a little bit more refined and elevated than some of those site experiences that you tend to get. Anyway, we did it in 2015. I forgot about it. It had a shelf life of a couple months, but we kept it online and it was available through like an archive link on our website. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to last year, and somebody sends me a Newsweek article about this website and how it's a hit on TikTok. Wow. And lo and behold, you look on TikTok and there's all these kids. Some of these TikToks have like 800,000 views, who are filming themselves using the site and then sharing the information on TikTok. And so it became this like weird second wave viral hit. Yeah. And it's unfortunate because it got so popular and we were on the hook for hosting at that point that we had to take it down after a certain period of time. But still, bizarrely, like it is one of the number one things that we get emails about is like, when are you going to bring back Predictive World? and I think that speaks to the thing I was saying earlier, where it's like, if you can do something that just appeals to kids and their sense of self and their curiosity about like how they stack up in the rest of the world, like that's touch paper for a really interesting, successful experience. Yeah,
it reminds me of that whole like Second Life thing,
Sure.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so totally dating ourselves now. So again, another sort of great segue into work. So you've done this project with Nike, the Air Max Day worldwide. Let's dive into that a little bit. I know we've got a film that we can kind of walk through here, but I'd love to kind of get your take on on how this project panned out for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is something that we actually just launched last week, and unfortunately, it was a gated members only experience. So it was only live for 24 hours. It was for Nike's Worldwide Air Max Day, which was on March 26th. Mm-hmm. And it's a great experience of what we were talking about earlier, where a client was taking an event that was normally experiential or done IRL and having to move it to digital almost out of necessity, right? So Air Max Day for Nike traditionally is an experience where all of their different geos, every major city across Nike tends to run local events, whether that's talks with influencers, talks with designers, talks with celebrities potentially, that all have to do with Air Max Day in some shape or form. And, normally they do those things. They're all handled at a geo level. This year, obviously, they couldn't do any IRL things. So they took everything online and they came to us with a brief to actually create this experience and to sort of lean into the fact that, folks can't travel anymore. So you're actually seeing the site now. This is what we built. This is what was live for 24 hours. There's basically 15 cities that were involved. I think 15 from Nike's standpoint, and every city had its own page. And the idea here is that on the day of Air Max Day, you could sort of travel between the cities and access all of that content from your computer that would normally have been running sort of only available to folks in each city. And so you've seen here that I just moved from New York to Paris. There is a sort of WebGL globe that you can use to travel. We created all sorts of content for this site. I mean, it was a real beast in terms of the content creation and the website build as well. The build itself was kind of a platform in and of itself. Like, people could chat on the platform. You could build a passport. You could customize it once you authenticate with your Nike login. There's some social components to it as well. As you move from one city to the next, you have a passport that accumulates stamps that you can share out. And then all of the citywide events were basically available on a timed basis. So you're seeing a sort of screen share of the site after the fact right now. So it's lost some of its aliveness. You're not seeing anything in the chat in the right window, for example. But the idea is here that there were basically 15 major events that were all sort of available to users over the course of those 24 hours. And we had a lot of repeat users, a lot of folks who were coming back to see specific things. There were also, in addition to all the content we created, there was just a ton of, interactive features. This is a 3D tour of Saquon Barkley's closet. He's a football player. He took us through his closet, talked us through a bunch of his favorite shoes. You can watch little videos there of him talking about his favorite Air Maxes. A big data piece here too, where you could see how many people were visiting other cities or how many people were on the site. So I think a really good example of what we were talking about earlier, where, had the pandemic not happened, I don't think that this site would have happened. But the fact that everybody is now locked in sort of necessitated the need to do something digital. And, my hope is that clients do work like this and then realize that there is actually a ton of value to doing digital experiences, have their eyes open to it. And, hopefully it will become a part of more clients' playbooks going forward.
So would you say that the work here was, I think there's a lot of briefs that I see that are very on the nose with commerce, right? So it was part of the brief here that they wanted to see some conversion with the sale of shoes, or is it really just about celebrating Air Max and the way it's all its forms and throughout the world?
It's a festival. It's more of a celebration, and there's more of a social angle to this than anything else. There's actually one link out to commerce, but by virtue of the fact that this was a global experience and we had people from all over the world viewing it, it's actually, everybody has different shoes that are available in their local area. So a real deep commerce integration would have been really difficult to do. This was just more about extending the spirit of Air Max Day, opening it up to a new generation and just getting people excited about the heritage and the future of the shoe.
Yeah, I love it. Keep thinking I'll unload some of my Air Max 97s, but they're really cool. They're green and funky. So, okay. So let's shift the conversation a little bit. And let's talk a little bit more about talent and collaboration and the pandemic and all that stuff. So we've all wrestled with these challenges of managing and leading through the pandemic, particularly with these very real and detrimental impacts like isolation and burnout and stress on and just mental wellness. And then on the positive side, I think, especially here at Adobe, we've seen a lot of the sort of resurgence and the crash course we needed to do in that March, April timeframe around remote collaboration, and to think more seriously about what teams look like in the future. So how do you approach this? I mean, really, this topic at Stink Studios. You've got 7 offices worldwide, plus the 12 for films if you're going to incorporate some of that.
Yeah.
So what does that look like for you guys?
Well, I think, I'm generally pretty skeptical of any sort of thought leadership that purports to know like what's going to change as a result of the pandemic. I mean, especially in the first couple months of the pandemic, there are all these people just saying these insane things about what the pandemic has changed forever. Mm-hmm. I tend to veer more to the conservative side with those types of predictions, because I think people are fundamentally, when the pandemic is over and when things open up, I think people are fundamentally going to want to return to their old lives. And as much as we've all been kind of like stuck in this shared place for the last year and have learned some new habits, I think once we have the optionality to see our friends and to go to work again, like we're going to want to exercise those options, right? Like those old habits will go away. So, I tend to be less bullish on how much the pandemic is going to change for everybody going forward. But one thing that I do think has definitely changed and that we're leaning into at Stink Studios is just this idea of complete employee optionality. Mm-hmm. Like I think the idea of an employee has a full-time job at a place and they're expected to be at an office from 9 to 6 every day or whatever it is. And there's that sort of rigidity of the 40-hour work week, and you have your desk and you're there every day. I think that's very much up for discussion. I think the pandemic has proved that it doesn't really matter how work happens, or in some cases when work happens, just as long as the work gets done. I think, people are probably tired of working from home right now because it just feels like Groundhog Day where you're stuck in the same environment consistently. But I think once you have the option to work from home or work from the office, the optionality and the ability to be able to say on the day, I would prefer to work from my kitchen today. I would prefer to work from the office today. I think that's the thing that people are going to want. So what we're trying to do is set up for when things open up, we're trying to set up an employee experience that leans into optionality as much as possible and gives the employee the freedom to sort of decide how they show up at work or indeed whether they show up at work in some instances.
Yeah.
And that affects a lot of things, that will affect our process and our structure for how we run projects. It will certainly affect our offices and what we look for in future office space. I think future offices are going to feel a little bit more like co-working spaces. Yeah. The most two important things for any office are going to be spaces to collaborate and spaces to concentrate. Yeah. But, we're looking for new office space right now in New York and LA. And in neither of those spaces do we feel like we need to have individual desks for everybody, because I'm kind of expecting that folks are going to be in the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week.
Yeah, and I think we've embraced the same thing at Adobe. I love how you just call it optionality, right? Like if the Bay Bridge is shut down because of some awful accident, I can be productive at home, right?
Yep.
And we've all proven that part, right? So I love that you're able to sort of cascade that same kind of philosophy throughout your team.
I think that's completely what it is. Like I have, thinking back to before the pandemic, I certainly had days where I would wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to get more work done if I stay home today. Yeah. If I go work at a coffee shop. And sometimes it's dependent on what kind of work you have to do. If it's just like you need to put your head down and write something, then it might be better to be away from the office. So I like the idea where people have the freedom to sort of roll their own and decide as they go.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned earlier that you were sort of the global traveling journalist. You've had to work remotely,
sure.
As part of your work, and same with me with agency work and with consulting. So I totally get that part. I guess too, somewhat related is this question of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So clearly 2020 was in many ways a year to be forgotten. But, again, in Twitter, I saw that your whole post last June about your commitment to change. So maybe if you could reflect on some of those words, it was very honest, the way that sort of that blog post read. But in the sort of employee experience and how that's shaping your recruiting and those kinds of things. Like, do you want to maybe comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the diversity question and that subject matter, I think, is genuinely the number one thing that keeps me up at night. And especially in digital, because digital has over-indexed on a lot of white dudes. So I think it's especially incumbent on like digital first companies to really lean into change and to try and find a way to build diversity and equity, not only into their leadership team, but into their whole team in general. So we're taking these measures. I mean, we're hiring for 6 leadership roles right now, and we're being very, very intentional about who we speak to and how we evaluate candidates. I think it's very, very important in the recruitment process the default is to consider somebody's portfolio in isolation, to consider their work experience in isolation. And I think, if this last couple of years has taught a lot of us anything, it's that that's not enough. It's not a meritocracy. That we like to think of the creative industries as a meritocracy, but that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
And it all stems back to socioeconomic conditions and the kinds of opportunities that people get in, when they're coming out of school or when they're coming out of high school. So it really changes you. It forces you to reevaluate the lens through which you evaluate what good is and with which you evaluate what great work is. And the way that we're looking at candidates right now is obviously what they do with the opportunities they're given is important, but you have to take like that full kind of background into context, and so we're taking it super seriously. I've said from the very beginning that like this is a marathon, not a sprint, and for things to truly change in the industry, if we're really, really invested in change, that change has to happen from the top down and the bottom up, so that's why we see it as a sort of like, I mean, there's so many levers that we need to pull, but it starts with making sure that we have diversity in leadership because people see that and respond to it. But it also makes sure that like you are building the next generation of creatives and the next generation of technologists. Like, how are you contributing to building that next cohort and actually like changing the terms for, or changing the workplace for the next generation of companies? So
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, about exposing opportunities. I was just I was just going through the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion with Omnicom. And we did what was called a creative jam with them, where it's a sort of design competition, and the challenge was around reinventing the employee experience for Omnicom around DE&I.
Right.
So just really interesting to kind of see how they view inclusion in the same way that you're talking about, where it's like about creating opportunities for people to grow their career, right? To take the ownership of that. Like one comment I had yesterday was, I often tell people that work for me or work around me that, you have to make your own career decisions or someone's going to make those for you.
Sure.
Right. So kind of along those lines too, what are some of the things that you might be doing as a leader? How's your work as a leader changed? Kind of given this, the optionality, the future of work, and so on. What things have changed for you?
Ooh, I will be very honest in saying that as far as my role is concerned, like this last 12 months has been the most difficult year that I've ever had, for sure. And I think that is because first of all, when the pandemic started, I mean, there was an element of disaster management that I had never experienced before. Especially in the US, we're in a context here where 35,000 people lost their jobs. 35,000 people in advertising alone lost their jobs in the first 6 months of the pandemic.
Wow.
So, when the pandemic started, I mean, we had a couple of clients who immediately pulled work off the table, and you started to feel the ground shifting under your feet, and you think, oh gosh, is this going to be like the whole bottom falling out? So you have to have meetings with your leadership team and with your partners about contingency plans in case all of that work goes away, and it's a lot of like scenario planning and sort of planning for the worst case scenario. That takes a lot of emotional overhead.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, we were able, we had a couple of like shaky quarters, but we were actually able to come through it super strong. The digital work came roaring back. I'm proud to say that, we didn't lose. There was nobody who lost a job at Sync Studios through the pandemic. We kept everybody on payroll and on healthcare. But then, on the back of that, once the business stabilized, then you're dealing with like a whole other aspect of leadership that is very, very difficult to handle from your kitchen table, which is just how everybody feels, that sense of belonging. It's so much easier to walk into an office and get a sense of how everybody's feeling just by the looks on their faces and by the energy in the room. It's much more difficult to do that over Slack, especially if you have a day where like Slack is kind of quiet. It's like Slack could be quiet because like there's a bunch of people who are just not feeling it today, or Slack could be quiet because it's just super busy and everybody's working. But it's hard to know because you can't see. So I take on, when I hear from a staff member that like they're struggling, or when I hear that, they are struggling to feel included in the team or feel like a part of something, I take that on. I really carry all of those emotions for staff. And that's another thing that just requires a lot of emotional overhead. Yeah. So, we're doing things to try and build that sense of inclusion, to try and build that sense of team. But it is really hard to do when you can't get everybody together, Yeah.
And I think part of what you're saying, I think what makes us maybe good designers, or in your case, designer and journalist, is empathy. Right? So taking on that, the feelings of your staff, super noble. And, at times it just feels natural, the natural thing to do.
Yeah. The other thing I will say that I feel, and I feel this as well in myself, is that, everybody's world has become, and I'm not saying anything new here, but everybody's world has become so much smaller in the last year. Mm-hmm. And their work lives and their home lives are now one thing. It's impossible. You have no separation between work and home. I think people are working much harder as a result. But I think also like the things that happen at work that you might otherwise like leave behind in a typical workday, you now carry with you, and they almost take on like an outsized effect because work has just taken up so much of people's lives. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing that I'm trying to be super mindful of, is that like, work is everything to folks right now. And I don't think that's by anybody's design. It's just how things have sort of ended up. And so I'm doing my best to try and create a culture at Stink where we're open and transparent. This is around burnout as well. Like, I'm trying to encourage people to say when they're burnt out. I'm trying to demystify this idea of burnout. I definitely had a moment of burnout. I'm still a little bit there about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And like, I made a point to tell staff, because I feel like if they see me saying it, then it's okay for them to put their hand up and say like, I'm feeling it too. Yeah. But I that's not a Stink problem, by the way. I think that's like a sort of industry-wide problem, or maybe even a worldwide problem, is that like we've all kind of reached the final mile of the marathon, and that's always the hardest one to run. Like when you can see the end in sight, but still nothing has changed, So,
well, I love this insight you have, and it's a lesson that was taught to me by a mentor many years ago, and that's about the shadow that you cast as a leader. Right. And so I think your ability to kind of take that step back and have a bit of humanity, right, and say like, look, I'm feeling it, and if I'm feeling it, you should be too, and you have to mind that, right? So I think that's a great thing to share with your teams to show that you have some vulnerability there.
Yeah, it's still hard though. Like it is. When I think back to I think on our current staff construction in the US specifically, and we probably have about 10 or 15 people more, 25, 30, if you include Buenos Aires, who have joined us during the pandemic. And so, those people have never had a chance to meet each other face to face, never had a chance to meet anybody kind of in an office context. So it's, it's harder to create that sense of intimacy and that sense of like, it's okay to share if there are people who are, have been with the company for 6 months, but still haven't had any physical interaction with anyone. That's a challenge that I think about on a regular basis. So again, I don't think this is like a Stink Studio specific problem, but it definitely, I think anybody in leadership can tell you that like they've learned a lot in the last year and have dealt with some things that they just never would have anticipated dealing with otherwise.
Awesome. So that's an interesting note though that you say. I mean, it sounds like you've had some growth. I mean, the digital work started coming back in after a couple quarters, you said, and then clearly you probably had to staff up for that. Where are you? I mean, how are you guys doing with that? Like with hiring, what are you looking for in people globally? Maybe the audience wants to know a little bit about that. And you mentioned Buenos Aires, so clearly you're recruiting globally as well. So what does it look like for a candidate at Stink?
So we're very open to remote hires. I think that's another thing that is, the Pandora's box on remote workers has been opened by the pandemic. And I think you'd be foolish not to consider that as like part of your staff mix going forward. And by the way, I'm not just talking about like hiring people in cities where we don't have offices, but I'm talking about giving employees in major cities right now the optionality to move to other cities and to work remotely from there. We're open to all of those options. We now have employees that are spread all across the U.S. and all across Buenos Aires, and their proximity to an office is not really a consideration or a factor when we hire them. One thing we still need to do some work on is to design a process for how we all work together once things open up, right? Because it's easy right now. Zoom is like the only way that you can really sort of interact with people. So I know on this Nike project, for example, we probably had about 60 or 70 people working on this project. And there were probably 15, 20% of them where I actually had no idea where in the world they were, and it didn't matter because Zoom is the great flattener, and Slack is the great flattener. Like it's just a name on a page and a face on a screen. When things open up and we do have people sort of congregating around offices again, and we do have meetings happening in the office, I think we're going to have to design a process that where we're working properly with people who can't be physically there, or we're, taking into account the fact that people are working in different time zones. That's definitely part of our homework for the next 3 or 4 months, I would say. But I think when I think about a world where like somebody can earn, a New York or an LA salary, but make it stretch, 30 or 40% further because they're living in like a small town in the US and therefore they have like a better and a happier life. That makes me happy too, because I think it's a win-win for everybody. So that will be here to stay, once things open up for sure.
Yeah, we've got a bicycling club on Slack with Adobe, and one woman we had a March cycling challenge, and one woman was posting these like epic rides through where she was based in Jackson, Wyoming, and I was like, wow! I mean, just like be able to work and do all the Adobe stuff and keep the cycling pretty strong there, and I'm assuming snowboarding and skiing too, like. You can really kind of have this sort of balance between your lifestyle and your life's work. So I love that.
I mean, we have the same. We have employees who are based, like I said, all over the U.S. A lot of them very, very close to nature, and it makes me so happy to see like their social shares where they're like, out hiking or skiing on the weekend just because they can do that because they're half an hour away from it.
Yeah, definitely. So let's shift a little bit now to the sort of. You're an award-winning agency. You create film. You've created all these experiences for these brands like Spotify and Nike. What inspires you, right? So, what are the like books, the podcasts, the websites, like things that inspire your creativity?
I think from like an advertising and marketing and digital creativity standpoint. the one thing that I read recently that kind of stopped me in my tracks was, do you know this guy Jay Zaza? He's he's a really experienced kind of industry creative. He's been ECD at RGA and Barbarian Group and a few others. I think he's at Marcel now.
Okay.
But he wrote this thing called Progressive Creativity, and I think that's on a website at progressivecreativity.vision is the URL.
Okay.
It's a quick read, but you know, the background is, I think there's a lot of discourse around the death of creativity and how digital has effectively killed the big idea, and how the ability to measure something digitally, how the need to have things travel in lots of different aspect ratios and across lots of different platforms is kind of stunting this idea, this classical idea of like old school advertising creativity. And this thing that Jay has written is basically a treatise that sort of denies all of that and advocates for a newer, more modern way of thinking about creativity that takes digital into account and treats it as being like in the water and something that we need to work with, rather than as some sort of like nasty obstacle that's getting in the way of like our big ideas. And it's really cogently written, and it also rings true with a lot of our experiences and our vantage point at Sync Studios. So it was really nice to see somebody articulate a lot of those things and to sort of just do away with a lot of the discourse around the death of creativity, because Jay's right. It's not dying, it's changing, and it's important to acknowledge that. So it's a relatively quick read. I mean, it's written, there's sort of 10 bullet points that are part of his treatise. It's very punchy, it's very bright. I highly recommend that if you haven't had a chance to read it.
So you mentioned then too that it's sort of manifesting a bit at Stink. So in the way you view things, like how so? What's an example?
Well, I think, you know, we're a pretty generalist company at this point. You know, we started in digital, so digital is a part of our DNA. But, you know, over the last 5 years, especially, we've done a lot of like just above the line kind of classical campaigns for big brands. And so we have, I think, a unique point of view because we've done kind of quote unquote classical above the line advertising, but we're also very digital first in the way that we approach things. And you know, whenever there is an idea that comes to us, whether it's a campaign or a digital idea, you know, we see the job of figuring out how those things interrelate as a challenge and as an interesting thing and as an exciting thing, rather than as an obstacle, you know. And I think what Jay is getting at is there are a lot of traditional creatives who maybe come from TV backgrounds who are used to the big idea that emanates from the top down, sort of informing everything else, them being annoyed at digital. And for us, it's a totally different thing. Like a great idea can actually start from the bottom up. And it's not about whether it's a big idea, it's about whether it's a stretchy idea. And it's about whether it's an idea that can actually travel in different contexts. And so, you know, we love the opportunity to think along those terms and to present work along those terms. And I think I don't see a lot of that in the market right now. I don't see a lot of agencies who seem to be like jumping at that. Everybody is kind of like a TV agency or a social agency, who's very much like very low to the ground, very bottom of the funnel. Yeah. But for us, like that sort of middle space where you can take an idea and stretch it into different platforms is where it gets really exciting.
Yeah, and that's the essence of creativity, right? I mean, trying to find what works on each of the platforms. So I love that. How about any trends that you might be seeing, right? So trends that might be in your work.
Oof. You know, every time I think I've spotted a trend, things change the next 6 months.
Yeah.
One thing that I definitely have noticed is the convergence of sort of, you know, brand and sort of utility, I guess, or consumer experience. I think, especially coming from a digital background, like there was a time as recently as 5 or 10 years ago where like anything transactional on the internet was over here, and anything experiential or sort of like playful or brand oriented was over here. And the rule books for how those things were meant to be built or for how they were meant to show up were completely different. Mm-hmm. And now I think as more and more customer experience becomes digital, we're starting to see a lot more playfulness and a lot more brand expression in those things. Like e-commerce experiences, for example, are no longer just designed to be like the most frictionless experience possible, because if you do that, then everybody's building the same website, right? Yeah. Everybody's building the exact same experience. There's no opportunity to land any brand moments, to land a sense of like playfulness or brand experience. So now that everybody's had like a version of the e-commerce website that is like just completely greased from the top to the bottom to sort of facilitate like maximum commerce, I think people are now realizing that, hold on, actually, we're missing a trick. Like we're missing an opportunity to actually land a brand story or some brand moments or some interactivity. So it's a thing that I've noticed for sure, is that like the convergence of those two things is starting to happen, and the Venn diagram of the work that sits in the middle is getting bigger and bigger.
I love that. I mean, like, because so many of those conversations I had about frictionless commerce and, you know, ability to get through your cart without logging in first. I mean, all that stuff, fewer clicks.
Yeah.
I totally remember that.
Which is, you know, and that's where we are, right? That's where we are right now, is that like commerce and performance and transaction rule everything. Mm-hmm. And of course it should, like that is ultimately the name of the game. But I also think it's a very sort of short-termist approach. You know, it's easy to make your first transaction, but how are you going to count on your 10th transaction with the same consumer? You know, there need to be brand moments. There needs to be a sense of what the brand is that you're engaging with, or else people are going to drop off and move on to the next thing. Yeah. And when everything looks and feels the same, it's like, it's easy to sort of like move between one thing and the other, because like, what's the difference, you know?
I mean, you're right. I mean, you think about like, not only are the sites looking the same, but the hooks into those sites are all the same. Everyone's running a promo campaign of some kind.
100%.
You know, that all goes into my promotions folder in Gmail, right? So sometimes I don't know that, you know, so that's very interesting. Are you starting to see some briefs like that though, where you're able to kind of do this sort of brand story hook, or maybe even the way that you get somebody back in other than say the blog portion of the site?
Oh yeah.
You know, what do those look like?
I think, you know, they start small, but I think what you see with super transactional sites is just kind of like a willingness on behalf of the client to be playful and interesting again.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing it in the world as well. Like I'm seeing a lot of sites that have launched in the last year where it's about like, you know, just building some brand equity with somebody rather than just getting them to purchase the thing. So
any examples that come to mind of that?
What's a recent example? RGA just did a thing with Benetton, the e-commerce site for Benetton, which is really sweet. And there's, you know, it's very commerce focused, but there's a sort of you can sort of mix and match tops and bottoms. So you can create these characters. And it's an example of, I think, how commerce specifically is changing. You know, they're trying to do something that is uniquely Benetton, but still, you know, sell clothing. And I think hopefully more and more brands, especially in the fashion space, will follow suit. Yeah,
that's great. So let's talk about the future. Where do you see Stink going? You know, in 5-10 years, like where are you guys going?
Well, I mean, we were in growth mode before the pandemic hit. We were launching some offices. We still launched Buenos Aires in San Francisco, which is where I am now. Mm-hmm. So we have folks in both of those cities, but obviously we don't have physical office spaces yet. So I think once things open up again, we'll continue to be in growth mode. You know, we'll have physical offices in San Francisco and New York and LA and Buenos Aires. We're building our presence in Shanghai and in Asia as well. And I think for us, like, we're just always going to chase opportunities to do great work, regardless of what the work type is. You know, we're pretty agnostic. So we have teams of people who do big branded campaigns, folks who do, you know, rebrand efforts, and then folks who do digital experiences. And for us, as long as there's an opportunity to do something interesting and creative, then we're in.
That's great. That's great. So did you actually have any music? You know, to any chill music to listen to while sipping?
So the reason I wrote that, and this comes from my journalist kind of cynicism about advertising in general, is that I think on that day, Pepsi had launched like a chill channel to listen to beats and to sip Pepsi to. And oh my God, Pepsi's not a client, as you can tell, but like stuff like that just makes my eye roll. I can't get over it. Like,
well,
yeah.
And what was so funny is that you apologized for people that actually answer that earnestly.
Yeah, I think I'm off Twitter now. I'm on a bit of a Twitter hiatus, but I think I followed up with the actual link to the branded Pepsi channel.
Well, okay, it's been great chatting with you, Mark.
Likewise.
I feel like we could kind of keep going, but we have this hour, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen and Tom here. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Big thanks to both of you. Jay, thanks for moderating and leading the great discussion. It's awesome to see you and have you with us today. And big thanks to you, Mark. I just appreciate so much of what you said today. And, in particular, it makes me really optimistic and hopeful about the industry when we have leaders like you who value creativity deeply, but also value people and value the impact that you're making, on culture and society in a really meaningful way. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, but if we can keep our eyes on that, we have an opportunity to not only make great work, but also do really fulfilling work too. And I think you guys are just an awesome model for that. So thanks for being with us here today and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. I know the viewers enjoyed it too. There's a lot of comments in the chat about just thank you so much for the insightful conversation. So I echo everything Tom said. Thank you both for the authenticity and the transparency in the conversation. It was great. So just to close us out, just as a reminder, the SoDA Series Live is a collaboration between Adobe and SoDA, the Society of Digital Agencies. Our goal is really just to bring you insights and information about what's top of mind for some of these creative leaders in the community. And we will be hosting another one next Thursday, May 13th, with Ross Crooks, who is the founder and CEO of Column 5. So please join us for that one at noon Eastern Time. Again, Thursday, May 13th. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you all. Have a great day or evening, wherever you're called in from. We'll see you soon.